Okay, let's get into this. Semaglutide. It's really, changed the game for weight management for so many people. We often hear about appetite, cravings, all that. But what if all that talk, the calories, the willpower, the discipline, what if it's actually just noise? Because today we're taking a deep dive that looks at something, well, pretty different. Our source material, and especially these insights from a guy named Dan Hollis, they suggest the real story behind weight loss isn't, primarily about food or willpower. It's about something else.
Yeah, and that something else is exactly what we want to explore in this deep dive. I mean, sure, lots of research looks at the physical side of semaglutide, how it works in the body, but what we're focusing on today, based on Dan Hollis's work, is how it might be this unexpected tool for, as he puts it, decoding emotional amnesia. We're really trying to understand what happens when, maybe for the first time in years, that constant internal monologue, that noise about food, just stops.
That's such a powerful line from Dan Hollis. It really stops you in your tracks. Semaglutide gives you silence, and silence gives you truth. Wow. I mean, that just completely reframes the whole conversation around weight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Our relationship with food. Suddenly, it's not about control. It's about something internal shifting.
Exactly. And Dan's core idea, it really comes through in the material, is that the way the world usually talks about fat and food, all the calorie counting, the carbs, the endless discipline, he basically says it's wrong. He points out that when people relapse, it's often not because they're suddenly starving again. It's more like, they're thrown into this deep confusion. They haven't been taught what to do with the quiet that this medication can bring. Familiar chaos is gone, right? And they're just lost. No map.
And that leads to that headline idea his insights suggest. What if you weren't broken, just confused? That's really... It hits differently, It shifts everything away from feeling like a personal failure towards maybe just not having the right understanding or the right kind of support. So how does Dan help people deal with that confusion, especially with his, let's say, unique approach, teaching people to sit in shame long enough to learn something from it? That sounds intense.
Well, what's really fascinating is how Dan describes what semaglutide actually does. He doesn't really frame it as just appetite suppression, not in the usual way. He says it gives you a moment where food stops talking. And for some people, that's the first honest moment they've had in 20 years. Think about that. The weight of that newfound silence, it's huge. But apparently it can also be deeply unsettling. It's like people lose this familiar, maybe even weirdly comfortable way of operating. So almost without thinking, they reach back towards the familiar chaos, the cheese puffs, cheat days, like he says, anything, really, to fill that sudden quiet void.
Right. Which brings us to Adrienne's story. Our material really paints a vivid picture here of what happens after the physical stuff starts changing. So Adrienne, she's been on semaglutide for months, doing well, appetite's down, knees feel better, clothes are fitting differently, you know the drill. But then she has this really specific, kind of jarring big moment. She's just brushing her teeth, looks in the mirror, and okay, she knows intellectually it's her reflection, but she just doesn't recognize the woman looking back. She felt, and this is the quote, like she didn't belong to her own reflection. That sounds incredibly disorienting.
It really does. And Dan actually has a name for that experience, something you definitely won't find on a medical chart. He calls it identity lag. And his explanation is quite profound, I think. He says your body can change faster than your story, and when that happens, the soul gets confused. So that highlights this idea that the real crisis isn't really losing the weight itself. It's those moments after the transformation. When the old routines fall away, the armor drops, as he puts it, and you're left standing there feeling almost like a stranger to yourself.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Adrienne wasn't really mourning the lost pounds. That wasn't it. She was mourning the version of herself who, quote, had carried them. The one who knew the ropes, right? Knew how to manage a room with a joke before anyone else could make one about her size, or which sweaters covered the most, which apology sounded just right. She was apparently really good at being her old self. Yeah. And now she felt like a mind without a map. Just adrift in this new reality.
And Dan's response to her in that moment, it's really key. He didn't jump in with the usual stuff like, oh, but you look great, or you should be so proud. No, he just listened patiently. He described it like being a mirror that doesn't ask questions, only returns what you're ready to see. And his crucial insight for her was this: the weight loss is just the clearing. The becoming takes longer. It really emphasizes that the internal shift, the rebuilding, that's a process. It doesn't just happen overnight because your body changed. It takes work.
Okay, so how do you actually do that work? Build that something new in the space that opens up. Dan talks about creating scaffolding in the space semaglutide opens, and this scaffolding involves things like framework, identity, ritual, language. It sounds quite intentional, like he's actively helping people, as the material says, with rewriting the story people were too full to finish. So filling that quiet with new meaning, not just emptiness.
That's exactly it. And they give concrete examples, which is helpful. Like they worked a lot on language, literally renaming things. So for Adrian, things shifted. Shame became memory. Not gone, but reframed. Control became curiosity. Less about rigid rules, more about exploring, and discipline became alignment. Finding what truly fits, you know? And these shifts, seemingly small, they gave Adrian permission to not know who she was, which is huge, and importantly, permission to build a new story without burning the old one down. It wasn't about erasing her past, but integrating it, evolving from it.
So how did Adrian's story kind of resolve or shift, maybe?
Hmm.
The mirror obviously didn't change its reflection overnight, but how she greeted it, that changed. She stopped sort of flinching away, maybe not smiling yet, the source says, but she just stood there longer. And as Dan would probably point out, that's not nothing. That's actually something really significant. It's like a signpost, isn't it? A quiet window opening, showing her starting to maybe belong to herself again.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us right back to Dan Hollis's central message, the core of this whole thing. It was never about the food. This whole deep dive into the quiet, into building what he calls inner architecture, that's where the real profound transformation happens. It's about, fundamentally rebuilding yourself from the inside out, not just tweaking the outside.
So, bringing this back to you, our listener, what does all this mean for you? Hopefully this deep dive has maybe shifted your perspective a bit on what tools like semaglutide could potentially unlock. That it might be less about forcing control and perhaps more about an intentional kind of surrender, opening up to a deeper journey of self-discovery that really begins when that usual internal noise finally quietens down.
Yeah, and maybe it leaves you with a question to mull over. Is there any area, in your own life where you might be clinging to a familiar story or maybe just familiar noise? Holding on to it because the silence, the quiet feels a bit too unsettling, too unknown. What could you potentially discover about yourself if you, just for a moment, allowed that silence, if you decided to really listen to whatever arrives in that space? And how might you maybe begin to gently rewrite your own story, even as Dan suggests, without having to burn the old one down completely? Something to think about.